Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to take a look at the overall image quality from the new Tamron 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 VC, and this is the G2 lens. And so as a part of this, just to give you an idea of what's being compared here, I've had actually 2 copies of the Tamron G2 lens in, and so I can check for overall kind of centering and consistency. And so just to give you a quick update on that, I found that both copies behaved quite similarly overall. I did find that one copy I felt was just a tiny bit better centered than the other, but overall I was happy to see that there was consistency. These are both 2 retail copies here, and so anyway, that helps there. I also will take a little look at comparing the previous generation, and this is the 70 to 200 f2.8 VC, and it was the code A009. And lens, and then of course the kind of gold standard, at least for Canon shooters, and that's Canon's own 70 to 200 L IS Mark II lens. So we're going to jump in and look at a variety of different metrics and see how these lenses stack up, and most importantly, how the new G2 lens performs. We're going to start the comparison by just going through the focal range and doing a direct comparison between the Tamron A025, that's the G2 on the left, and then we will be having the Canon 70 to 200 f2.8 L IS Mark II on the right. And so starting off at 70 millimeters, and we'll work our way through the focal range. As you can see, there is obviously some difference in magnification that I've already covered, but if we look and compare the images here in the center, we can see that the Tamron is clearly the sharper instrument here. You'll notice that there are some chromatic aberrations here on the Canon that aren't present on the Tamron, and so that of course causes a little bit more blurriness and a little less contrast. Now that becomes even more apparent if we move out towards the sides of the frame, and here we find that the chromatic aberration becomes much more pronounced on the Canon, and thus everything looks softer and less distinct, obviously much more contrast and detail. If we jump over to the right side, we find a similar, although less chromatic aberration on the right side for the Canon, and so maybe a little bit of decentering there on that. But overall, we have a very nice crisp result from the Tamron. One other thing that is illustrative here about looking at this is a comparison of vignette and then also light transmission. So you can see we've got equal settings. I've converted both of these to black and white because they do render color, even though I have a constant white balance set, a custom 5000 Kelvin white balance. They render color a little bit differently, and so that can obscure some of these things. But I just wanted to give you a look at the overall comparison of the vignette, and then also if we eliminate the vignette and we zoom to a 1-to-1 level, and it's, you know, there's not a major difference here, but I did see pretty consistently throughout the focal range that the center is a little bit brighter on the Tamron than it is on the Canon. And so I would say that Tamron has managed to produce a little bit better light transmission as compared with the Canon lens. Just to give you a quick look comparing the A009, that is the lens that the A025, the G2, replaces. Here in the center we see that they're fairly close, but you can see better contrast and a little bit more distinct detail for the new lens, the A025. Out towards the side, that becomes more true, and you can see that Tamron seems to have optimized the optical formula to where it's more consistent across the frame. And that's pretty obvious when we look a little bit further out that the newer lens is clearly better towards the edges of the frame. It has a little advantage in the center, but a significant advantage out on the edges. So now we're at 100 millimeters or 102 millimeters when it comes to the Canon, and so we'll look in the center. I've not tried to adjust for the framing, so you are seeing the difference of framing between these 2 lenses due to the focus breathing issue that we talked about. And also some have pointed out that at closer distances the Canon actually breathes in the opposite direction to where it almost becomes longer than its stated focal length. Anyway, we're just looking at image quality here, and as you can see, once again at 100 millimeters, there's still an advantage for the Tamron. Little more haze. You can still see a hint of that chromatic aberration, and so as as a result, there's better contrast and better detail rendering on the Tamron. And we'll try to look towards the extreme edge here since the Canon is a little further out towards the edge. You can definitely see a pretty marked difference overall in the resolving towards the edges of the frame, that the Tamron continues to hold a pretty decent advantage there towards the very edge of the frame overall. And so 100 millimeters, we see that the same trend has remained true. Now a quick look at the A009, the previous generation lens from Tamron. We see the same kind of trend here, you know, just slightly better sharpness in the center, and then as we look towards the edge, a more pronounced improvement, less haze, more distinct rendering and resolution from the new G2 lens. So now at 135 millimeters or 135 millimeter-ish on the case of the Canon. So let's jump in, let's look towards the center. And of course this isn't really center, this is the bottom center of the frame, but you can see that both these lenses are now producing a pretty exceptional result, and I would say the center is pretty close to a tie from what I can tell. If we look towards the side of the frame, we can see that the Tamron has still a little bit of an advantage, just a little bit crisper detail rendering, although the Canon is getting closer here, and the difference is less extreme at this point. Now if we compare the new Tamron versus the older Tamron, once again just a hint more sharpness in the middle, and moving out towards the side we can see same trend here, where at 135 millimeters the new G2 lens is just that much sharper, with sharpness extending out towards the edges of the frame more consistently. Now at 200 millimeters, the situation reverses in that the Tamron, or excuse me, the Canon is clearly optimized for performance at 200 millimeters. We saw at 70 millimeters, it's a little bit weak, but at 200 millimeters, we find that the Canon is now the sharper. And again, you know, it's not like they're hugely different here, but you kind of in an equal way at 135 millimeters that the Tamron had the advantage. I would say that the Canon does here. You can just see more distinct detail in this portion of the frame, and here in this the focus ring here, there's just more detail there. Off towards the edge of the frame, you know, the Tamron, I think, you know, it shows the worth of the evenness of its focus. So even though the Canon is sharper in the center of the frame, out here on the edge of the frame, I would say that the Tamron is the one that has slightly more contrast and just a hint more detail, although, I mean, they are very, very close. And likewise on this side of the frame, the Canon looks a little bit better here on the right side of the frame. And so, but anyway, I would say there's a little bit more contrast for the Tamron here on the focus ring. But overall, these lenses are very close, though the Canon has the advantage in the center of the frame at 200 millimeters, which of course a lot of people, that's very important. Now once again, just a quick look at the overall vignette situation here. We see that at 200 millimeters, the Canon has a little bit more overall vignette, and you can see also that it comes further into the frame. One thing that I noted when I compared looking at vignette to the previous generation of Tamron is that while there's often similar levels in the extreme corners, on the G2 it doesn't extend as far into the frame, and so just a slightly better result. Now, as far as the light transmission, let's look here at 200 millimeters, and I think it's a little bit more obvious here that at equal shutter speeds, equal ISO settings, exact same lighting, that the center of the Tamron is definitely brighter than what the Canon is. And of course the Tamron is a newer lens, newer coatings, all of that. And so I would say that light transmission is better on the new G2 lens than what it is on the older Canon. Now a quick peek here on APS-C, and then I'll jump through this fairly quick, but one thing we'll find is that while the trend remains basically the same as full frame, the difference is that the Canon does really well in the center of APS-C. You can see that there's a bit of the chromatic aberration, but although a lot of lenses, full frame lenses, will show more chromatic aberration on APS-C, the opposite is actually true here with this lens. And so here I would say in the center of the frame there's actually a little bit of an advantage for the Canon on APS-C. However, as we move off to the sides, we see that the old trend is there, and that the Tamron is the better lens towards the side of the frame. Here at 100 millimeters, or ish, once again, we see the same thing. Canon is a little bit better in the center, although it was poorer on full frame. It really does great on APS-C. and then out towards the edges of the frame, it is the Tamron that definitely has a better performance towards the edge of the frame, and that's true on both sides. 135 millimeters, same kind of trend here overall. Canon looks better in the center, and then off towards the sides, it is definitely the Tamron that looks better. And so I would say the conclusion to draw here is that, you know, both lenses are going to perform well on APS-C, but we will find that the Tamron just has a little bit more even resolution across the frame. And so you have to decide for yourself how big of a deal it is. Now here in the center at 200 millimeters, this is where the Canon is the absolute best, and we certainly see that. In the center of the frame, it is the stronger lens by a good margin on APS-C. And if we look out towards the edges of the frame, I think that there's still a bit of an advantage for the Canon. It's not as distinct towards the edge of the frame, but at 200 millimeters on APS-C, I definitely give a fairly significant win to the Canon lens. Now, Tamron has released a new line of extenders, teleconverters, and a 1.4 times and a 2 times that are compatible with this lens. So just to give you a quick look at image quality, this is at a pretty close focus distance, as you can see, and with the 1.4 times, you can see, although the plane of focus is very shallow, that sharpness holds up actually really well here, and so a lot of detail there. And of course, if you stop this down to to deepen your depth of field, you would get a pretty fantastic result. And so overall image quality is holding up quite nicely at, and of course this is at 280 millimeters, or the place where the Tamron is the weakest across its focal range. Next few images, just real-world images with the 2 times converter attached. And so overall, I can see, detail is good. There's a little bit more haze that has been introduced, so a little bit of contrast has been lost. However, this is at f5.6, which is wide open, 400 millimeters. That's certainly still very useful there. And likewise here, 400 millimeters, f5.6. Again, you can see there's just a little bit of haze at a pixel level, but in terms of the overall detail here, detail is good, and with a little post-processing, obviously still a very useful result. Now, just looking at the real-world sharpness, just a couple of real-world images here. So this is 200 millimeters, f2.8, wide open. And so I was probably about 25 feet away from the subject here, this cute little donkey. And as you can see, lots of detail there overall, and certainly a very useful performance, wide open at 200 millimeters. Here is, and this is actually the former image and then this image were both shot with 2 different copies. I have a couple of the G2 lenses on hand just to check for consistency overall. And so here, although it's higher ISO, so you can see a little bit more noise and perhaps a little bit of loss of detail due to that, our focus point was on the eyes, and you can see a lot of great detail there. Certainly a very useful performance overall. This is on APS-C, just to give you a sense of that. And so here I am taking the picture, but let's look at detail overall here. And as you can see, even on APS-C, there's lots of sharpness and detail there. And so a nice result overall. Now this shot is at ISO 4000, and so a shot from probably about 15 feet away. And just to give you an idea, and I'm not covering focus on this particular episode, but I will say just that focus is fantastic. I was shooting for his eyes, and you can obviously see there is just great detail in the eyelashes, even at a higher ISO setting, ISO 4000, 5D Mark IV, and the overall global image, of course, looks great. Nice fall off to defocus there, and so anyway, a good looking image overall. Now, of course, if you move towards optimal settings, this is actually a panorama that's combined of 4 vertical frames shot at f5.6. 70 millimeters, and so this is, I would say this is close to, optimal for the lens. And as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of detail that is rendered just, across the frame into the distance. So if you're wanting to shoot landscapes with the lens and stop it down, obviously you can get fantastic results doing that. And finally, we'll wrap up with just a few other details. this is kind of worst case scenario here. I shot with the sun, it's the epicenter of the sun's right here. And I also stopped down to f11, which tends to exaggerate ghosting effects. So this is probably not a scenario you're going to repeat too often out in real world shooting. But I wanted to give you a look at the flare pattern. The Canon is on the, we'll reverse them again just for consistency's sake. Tamron on the left, Canon on the right. And so what I see here, of course, is that some of the ghosting effect is out of the frame here. So both lenses will produce some ghosting, as you can see from the Tamron. Both of them will do some veiling, lose a little bit of contrast. As you can see, however, the Canon image has really washed out by comparison. And there's much more prismatic haze here overall. And so the Tamron has definitely retained more contrast, you know, at exact same settings here. So overall, I would say that the more modern coatings of the Tamron, they show their worth here, that while this is not the best result that I have ever seen from either lens, certainly the Tamron does a much better job of retaining contrast and, you know, kind of less of just an overall blowout of the image. Okay, now just a quick look at just the overall kind of bokeh circles here, highlight circles. And so there's a few things that I want to point out. In this kind of setting, the Tamron on the left has a little bit of a busier interior compared to the Canon on the right. However, the advantage for the Tamron is that you can see here on the Canon that that inner line is fairly well pronounced here. Meanwhile, on the Tamron, it's not nearly as visible. So that's actually quite a positive thing in that it means that in transition areas, the Tamron is going to pick up a few less hard edges and probably produce a little bit softer bokeh, with all things being, you know, equal. Now, I will point out that both of them will produce, as you can see, the cat eye effect towards the edge. And so there's also some give and take here in that the Tamron retains a little bit more circular shape towards the edges of the frame. However, towards the extreme edges, we find that there's a little bit more squeezing, a little more of a lemon shape or cat eye shape on the Tamron towards the extreme edges as compared to the Canon overall. And so I don't know that you can call either a clear winner. They're just different. Here's another example without so much of bokeh highlights, but we have a focal point here of this on this decoration. So here's, you know, where we're shooting both of them at. And then as we kind of look at defocused areas, I'm just going to kind of scroll through here and let you draw some of your own conclusions here. I think that when I look at it, there's some give and take overall. And so I don't necessarily pronounce either one a clear winner here, but both of them are capable of producing nice, soft, defocused areas without a whole lot of objectionable material. And I think that I look at different points where I like, you know, here I like the look of what the Tamron's producing more than the Canon. However, I look at some other places and I like the look of the Canon a little bit better overall. So it's all about perspective. Neither one of them are doing anything terrible here. So as you can see, while there is some give and take in the whole process, overall throughout most of the focal range, the new Tamron is actually demonstrably superior in terms of overall resolution and image quality compared to the Canon. It has no chromatic aberration at all that I've seen at any point, and neither does the Canon on the longer end, but at the wide end it does exhibit some chromatic aberration. Throughout the focal range, it shows a little bit less vignetting overall, at least in terms of the penetration into the frame, and it shows a better light transmission when all settings are equal. Now at 200 millimeters, however, or towards the end of that focal range, I don't know exactly where that transition takes place, but somewhere between 135 millimeters and 200 millimeters, there's a swap that takes place to where the Canon is the sharper lens overall. Most notably in the center, not by a huge margin, but in a noticeable way, whereas the Tamron is pretty close to it along the edges. The one thing I think you'll glean from that early resolution test is that the Tamron actually produces a very consistent performance across the frame, and so in some places, even where the Canon shows a kind of superiority in the center of the frame, the Tamron still holds its own towards the outer portions of the frame. And so they've really optimized the optical formula to where you're getting a very even result. We also saw that while, at least in the tests that I ran, I wouldn't declare a clear winner, that if anything, the Tamron is certainly as good as the Canon in its overall bokeh rendering. And I think that some people will find the overall rendering to be actually more pleasant. Where the Canon will win in that is that because it doesn't focus breathe, and thus at close range it's going to compress the image a little bit more and produce more defocused backgrounds. And so if you're really shooting a lot at very close focus distances, the Canon will give you more bokeh compared to the Tamron overall. Saw that the Tamron did better, although it's still not an amazing performance, but better than the Canon when it came to flare resistance and when the sun is put into the frame. And so in a variety of metrics, we see that the Tamron optically, it definitely holds up to the gold standard that is set by the Canon. And I don't know that I would necessarily declare it the winner overall, because there is some give and take, but I certainly don't think that anyone that is actually shopping these two lenses is going to be disappointed with what they get optically out of either one. And the Tamron, I think if anything, you could safely say that it is just as good, and in some ways, and at least in some parts of the focal range, it is demonstrably better. And certainly if you are looking at the improvement from the previous generation, Tamron 70-200 f2.8 VC, it's a very clear upgrade there, and it's better optically all along the way. It's got better build, better autofocus, better feature set, better VC. It's just better in every way, and so it's pretty fantastic. And when you consider the overall price difference between these two lenses, in the US market you can get the Canon lens for, let's say, $2,000-ish. It will be up and down, depending on sales and rebates. The Tamron is coming to market at $12.99, and so basically a $700 discount going for the Tamron. And so the fact that the Tamron is right there with it, maybe even better in some ways, optically makes it a pretty fantastic bargain. And if you're in other markets, there will be some play back and forth. Here in Canada, for example, the difference between the two lenses is closer to $1,000 Canadian, and so certainly makes it a very attractive option for those that are looking for a great lens but maybe don't want to shell out the full bang for the Canon lens. So hopefully that helps you overall. In my final episode that's coming on this, I will be giving my final verdict and examining autofocus and just the overall handling and performance in an absolute sense. And then I will do one kind of final companion segment where I will actually go through and break down the pros and cons of the Canon versus the Tamron G2 and lay it out there very plainly, at least as far as my estimation. And so maybe that will help you if you're weighing between the two lenses. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the linkage down below, you can take a look at that image gallery that I alluded to. I've added a lot of content there with extenders, with on APS-C, and of course, using on full frame as well. And that might help you to draw some conclusions also. You can follow me on social media or sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.